that, good afternoon and thank you to the Massachusetts State Senators, Representatives, State Health staff, and coalition members for joining us this afternoon. My name is Demi Stoltz, and I'm the Massachusetts Policy Director here at uAspire, a Massachusetts-based nonprofit focused on college affordability. Welcome to this afternoon's briefing on HB 1294, an act to facilitate student financial assistance, more widely known as Universal FAFSA legislation. We are all here today because we care really deeply about building a truly equitable education system here in Massachusetts, where students have the opportunity to pursue their goals after they graduate, whatever those may be. With that, I would like to extend thanks to Representative Vargas for introducing this bill, and to now pass the torch to Rep. Vargas to say a few words. Representative.
Thank you so much, Femi, and thank you all for logging on today to learn more about this bill and how you can get involved and participate. I just want to recognize some of the legislative offices that are here. I see Rep. Viola's office. I see Representative Don Shan is with us. Senator DiDomenico's office is with us. Senator Rush's office, Rep. Dom's office, and I know folks will continue to trickle in. And if I didn't recognize your office, please do write your name in the chat. Thank you so much for making the time to join us. And to uAspire and the entire coalition that you're all building, thank you so much for doing the work of organizing this briefing and for advocating for what I think is one of the most important higher ed bills that are in play this session, and that is our Universal FAFSA legislation. The bottom line is that we're leaving millions of dollars on the table right now for Massachusetts students, $48 million to be exact. In Massachusetts, only 60% of students actually fill out the FAFSA, and we've yet to return to the pre-pandemic levels that we had for FAFSA completion. I think we're 14% below what the FAFSA completion rate was before the pandemic. And when you think about where the FAFSA can have the greatest impact, it's in low-income communities, low-income districts, where the application can produce the most financial assistance. And unfortunately, those are the exact districts where completion rates are taking the hardest hit. And so when we came across this issue, we started to do some homework on what other states have done to try to address this. And we came across Louisiana, which had some model legislation to ensure that every student either filled out the FAFSA or waived their right to. But at the very least, there was a conversation that was happening between a student, a guidance counselor, or some staff member in the school district to talk about the FAFSA, the importance of the FAFSA, and how it could facilitate them attending college. And when we looked at what the impact was in Louisiana, we were really impressed. Within the first year, the completion rates between high-income districts and low-income districts closed by 87%. The gap that existed between high-income and low-income districts closed by 87%. And by the second year, the gap was completely eliminated. And so we have a policy that has been proven. We have legislation that we know works. And we know that here in Massachusetts, one of our strongest assets is our knowledge economy and is our workforce. But it's also a vulnerability right now, given the cost of living here in Massachusetts, the cost of higher ed here in Massachusetts. And so one of the things that we can do, of course, for our students, but also for our economy and long-term affordability goals here in Massachusetts, is ensure that every single student is receiving the financial assistance that they qualify for, and that they even think about college as a possibility, right? I mean, that's the other piece about FAFSA, is that for many students, college isn't a possibility in their minds until they fill out the FAFSA, until they learn more about the financial assistance that they could be eligible for. So this process is not just about the financial assistance and the workforce implications on our economy, but it's also about possibility and showing the possibility of higher ed to students and communities that often have not seen higher ed as being financially feasible. So I'm super jazzed and excited about this bill. I think it's incredibly important that we advance this bill this session, and I'm just very grateful for the coalition that's rallying around this and appreciate the work that you're doing to get this on the agenda. There are thousands of bills, hundreds in higher ed, I'm sure, that have been filed. And so it's important for us to do what we can to show the merits of this legislation and the urgency of this legislation. So I just want to thank you for your commitment and for your steadfast focus on equity, because that's what this bill is about.
Thank you, Rep. Vargas. And, oh, sorry about that. So with that, I just want to, oh, sorry about that. I had a little glitch there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So looking at the agenda today, thank you again, Rep. Vargas. We are going to start with talking about why we're focusing on the FAFSA, talk a little bit about how this legislation can help, talk about the research that uAspire has been doing nationally on these universal FAFSA policies. We'll discuss our recommendations that have come as a result and make a comparison to how HB 1294 stacks up to those recommendations. And then we'll hear a little bit about what this bill means for the equity agenda and hear a few words from students before opening up the floor for Q&A. Okay, so the free application for federal student aid, which I will call the FAFSA from here on out, is the federal form that students complete to learn about their financial aid eligibility. We are putting emphasis on the FAFSA as a means of increasing college enrollment for a very straightforward purpose, and that is that FAFSA completion is one of the strongest indicators for immediate college enrollment. So students who complete the FAFSA by the time they graduate are 84% more likely to enroll in college than their peers who do not complete the FAFSA by the time graduation rolls around. That is particularly important right now because our enrollment rates have dipped almost 10 percentage points since 2017. And if helping students complete the FAFSA will ultimately prompt them to pursue post-secondary education, it's a more than worthwhile pursuit to ensure that these students complete the financial aid application before graduation and are aware of their aid eligibility. So we are in a state that really prides itself on academic excellence, but in this state, we still have some pretty blaring disparities when it comes to college enrollment. So on this chart, we're looking at DESE's data from just last year, and we can see that about 60% of white males enrolled in college immediately after high school, compared to just 45% for Black males and just under 30% for Latino males. If we take this variable and switch it out and look at it by income level, we can also see that there are some pretty drastic disparities as well. So we can see that non-low-income males are nearly twice as likely to enroll in college than their low-income counterparts. And with the data for males put out front, I just want to, before we talk about female stats, I want to say that yes, females are at this point in history more college going. That is a true statement across races, across ethnicities, and across income levels. So does that mean that if we then switch out that gender variable, that these numbers will be dramatically different? And unfortunately, the answer is no. So yes, women are more likely to go to college than their male counterparts. But when we look again by race, we can see that white females are significantly more likely to go to college than Black females and Latina females. And that one variable, that one race variable, can increase a person's likelihood of going to college by 30% if we're comparing Latina females to white females. It's something that is critical to our equity agenda that we tackle, and that we make sure that those men and women who fall into those low income categories or who are identifying as BIPOC students are also being able to access college and information about college at the same rates as their higher income and white counterparts. And if we look at the income levels, again, for women, we can see that low income females are going to college at about a rate of 50%. But again, if you just take out that variable and look at non-low income females, you can see that that increases to nearly 80%. So we can start to make some changes now by ensuring that students are aware of their aid eligibility. All students are aware of their aid eligibility before they reach commencement. Another thing that Representative Vargas already pointed out, but another reason to focus on FAFSA completion is that over $48 million in unused health funding was left on the table just last year because eligible students did not fill out the FAFSA and take advantage of eligible aid. With college enrollment down and with enrollment disparities persisting, it does make sense for us to do better as a Commonwealth to ensure that these students are aware of their aid eligibility before they reach commencement. And FAFSA legislation is meant to address some of the considerations that we just spoke about for students. So 40% of first-generation students and 37% of low-income students reported completing the FAFSA themselves in comparison to just 11% for higher-income students. The FAFSA can be difficult, and it can be that much more difficult when you're completing it alone as a first-generation student. Of course, it's difficult when you don't have guidance and you're tackling something for the first time, which is why we're calling for support for students in completing the FAFSA. Also, for the lowest income students, that's where FAFSA completion is associated with the most drastic increase in college enrollment. So those students who are completing the FAFSA by themselves and struggling, those are the students who are the most likely to benefit from going to college. So we see a 127% increase for students in the lowest economic quintile. So that, again, that one variable of making students aware that there is funding available for them can drastically change their perspective on whether college is an option for them or not. Before I transition in, we talk a little bit about uAspire's research, I will lastly mention again that Rep. Vargas pointed out, but Louisiana was the very first state to make the FAFSA mandatory for the graduating seniors. And again, 87% increase between low and high income districts within 1 year. And that gap was gone within 2 years. So right now in Louisiana, they have students in low income districts and students in higher income districts completing the FAFSA at the same rate, which is what we hope to establish here in the Commonwealth. I will also add that, the reality is that some students are getting a good amount of information about college and they're getting good prompts about college and about financial aid, but that information is not being distributed equitably. So some students are getting tons of information and motivation about college and other students are not accessing that same amount of information. We think that all students should be made aware of their aid eligibility and should be presented with college as an option, whether they choose to pursue it or not. It's a decision that should be up to the student. With that point, I think it's a great opportunity for me to pass the torch to my colleague, Mireya Sandoval, who is uAspire's Senior Director of State Consulting. She is going to talk to us a little bit about the research that uAspire has been doing on the national level over the last couple of years on universal FAFSA policies. Mireya, the floor is all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Femi. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Mireya Sandoval, Senior Director of State Consulting here at uAspire. Really happy to be able to jump in and be here with you all and share a little bit more about what I've been working on and learning more of the impact of universal FAFSA policies across those states who have implemented currently. We've been hearing more about universal FAFSA policies. We've seen more states from Louisiana to have started implemented it as well. And now we're seeing more and more states, Massachusetts, considering this policy as well. So I think through our research, we really wanted to understand what is happening in the states who have implemented universal FAFSA policy. So we took the opportunity to both interview and survey practitioners across Alabama, California, Illinois, Louisiana, and Texas, who have an active universal FAFSA policy to really understand what are some of the opportunities and challenges that are happening when it comes to these policies for practitioners as well as both students and families when it comes to these processes, to these policies. We really want to understand too, like, what are some of those supports that are really helpful that are coming from the state? Also understand, like, what are some like good interventions that we see schools practitioners are doing to support students in navigating the financial aid process. And also identify what are still some of the gaps that exist when it comes to financial aid form completion as well. So through all this work and having some great conversations and through their surveys with practitioners across these states, we gathered some additional information and we will be sharing a few more of those opportunities and challenges that are coming up with these policies. But before doing that, I want to highlight some of like the data from these states. So here you'll see on this slide, we have Louisiana, Illinois, Texas, and Alabama. So we see the year, you'll notice on the teal, it's the year before Universal FAFSA policy is implemented. So those are the FAFSA completion rates for the state. Then in the blue, you will notice that this is the year after Universal FAFSA has been implemented. And so you will see that every state went through an increase in FAFSA completion over year. Really want to pinpoint like Texas and Alabama, like they had a huge jump when it came to FAFSA completion rates there. And on the side, you also notice the ranking. We see the FAFSA trackers that exist online and rankings when it comes to FAFSA completion rates. And you also will notice the big jump that they did from the year before to after implementation there as well. I know at the moment we do not have California highlighted, which is the other state that has an active universal FAFSA policy, but they're already showcasing an increase in numbers. For example, even though they're still going through their first year of implementation, we're also already noticing a 21% increase in FAFSA completion when it comes to comparing February 2023 to February 2022. So that's already a huge jump, like I said, of 21% increase here as well. And with that, want to highlight from, of course, like conversations that we had with practitioners, like what are some of the opportunities that are coming up as more states are implementing universal FAFSA? So I really want to highlight first, a lot of practitioners sharing with me of like a lot of stories of them talking with their students, talking about like, hey, you need to complete your FAFSA because of the requirements, but also students realizing like, oh, college is a viable option for me. Many of like great stories of like students coming in and be like, I didn't know this was an option. I didn't know I had access to financial aid for this. So they're like excited that this is an opportunity and finding that out that is an option for them. So definitely a lot of great stories coming from my conversations on that. Also, we're also noticing an increase in starting the financial aid process conversation earlier. Not only just starting the conversation during the student's junior year, but we also notice starting the conversation as early as middle school and 8th grade with students. And not only just having the conversation with students, but also with parents. They really wanted to build that awareness, the earlier, the better. That way they're not shocked, like once it comes to a student senior year and be like, hey, let's introduce the FAFSA now. But at least they have heard it multiple times throughout starting from 8th grade on, that they were feeling more comfortable, hopefully more comfortable in creating that buy-in for both students and parents when it comes to the financial aid process. To add to that, also a lot of more students realizing that they could leverage financial aid for additional pathways as well. So maybe they don't want to go to college right away. Maybe they're interested in other certificate programs or vocational programs or trade programs. So they were excited to find out that they could leverage financial aid to help pursue some of those additional programming as well. So a lot of highlights coming up on that as well, and a lot of more practitioners focusing on also seeing what other pathways are available for students as well. I think also a big takeaway I took is how like a lot of community was built around within schools, school districts, community partners coming together to support one another when it came to FAFSA completion. So we saw a lot of like schools and school districts actively involving everybody within the schools to learn more about the FAFSA, even from admin, front desk admin, to teachers, and so forth, to come to professional development trainings to understand like what is a FAFSA process, and even just understanding the basics and where to point the student to the right direction for more information. It was really great to see like, hey, I also got the help of my principal helping us out and messaging this out to students and families. A lot of more schools and school districts coming together to build like financial aid committees to support universal FAFSA policy as well, and how to message it and community to their communities as well. And talking about building community and partnerships, also one of the biggest partners that we've seen from our conversations, where they were really leveraging community, like their local higher education institutions were a huge partner in a lot of these financial aid events, creating capacity for our schools and school districts for practitioners. So leveraging sometimes them coming and doing events for the schools, pointing them to resources. So they were some of the huge partners through all this work from the themes from our conversations with practitioners, and also community partnerships, leveraging not community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, and understanding like also what other supports can they leverage from the community to support and making FAFSA known within the communities. And finally, as we shared within the numbers in the last slide, it was an increase in financial aid form completion. The numbers are there. Also, there was, we could see from Louisiana, there was also an increase in college enrollment. For example, during the first year from class of 2017 to 2018, when it was implemented, we saw an increase of 6.7% increase in college enrollment from students there. So it's not just impacting that increase in completion, but also enrollment. I do want to flag too that a lot of the other states, we still have Alabama and Texas who are still hoping to release their enrollment numbers as well. But also important to notice to flag, I mean, that Illinois, Texas, and Alabama did implement universal FAFSA, or were planning for universal FAFSA during like when we were in peak COVID times as well. So not only were they implementing or figuring out how to implement these policies, but also navigating that as well. And with that, do want to highlight some of the challenges that came up from like our conversations with practitioners around these policies as well. First and foremost is inconsistent communication. A lot of conversations about like, oh, we building a communication plan to better disseminate the information for everybody, from practitioners to students to families, to understand what is this new policy, what are the requirements, and so forth. So a lot of, which takes me to my next point around family pushback and lack of knowledge, where a lot of parents were sharing, they were like, oh, where is this coming from? Are the schools the one enacting this policy? Is it coming from the state? So I think as more as possible, creating a communication plan and disseminating as much as information and creating the awareness about like what's coming is very important. And also have it in very accessible ways. Any information that is created, and of course having it available in multiple languages and so forth, and making it more accessible for students, families, and practitioners as well. Also with that, there was also a lot of practitioners sharing more about like capacity. There was a lot of more financial aid form FAFSAs that they had to complete with students. So naming that capacity was a thing for them also, since they had to also have more conversations with students and parents about the process. So capacity being a thing that they really wanted to flag about the challenge that they were encountering as well. Which takes me to funding, why I think funding, a lot of these policies are unfunded for implementation, so they do not offer funding for implementation. So there's no funding available for them. So it's very important to have that funding. And there were a lot of sharing like, it would be great to have more funding for professional development, for more training, to create more resources, even to build those communication plans as well. So having that funding available to leverage and help build capacity too. And with that, last two I would highlight in the challenges is inconsistent opt-out process. Majority of states have like a standard form. I know California is the only one that has like a template, and school districts are able to make some edits and changes to it. But when it came to the process of the opt-out, I think having more guidance from the states on how to be able to share the opt-out process and how to track the opt-out process as well was another thing that was flagged as a challenge as well. And finally, varying data tracking practices when it comes to tracking completion. I know many of the states we connected with, they did have their own tracking and have their own systems, but even counselors wanted to make sure practitioners that they were tracking their own ways on how they were tracking their information, making sure that they were not missing out on any of the students who were completing the processes as well. So that led to them building their own systems, connecting them to systems. There's sometimes a mismatch on data when it comes to completion as well. So making sure creating a more universal piece also when it came to tracking as well was something that they were looking for interest as well when it comes to the policy. So that's a little bit more of what we saw in like opportunities and challenges. And I'm very excited to pass it now back to Femi to share a little bit more about our uAspire's policy recommendations, especially as we're thinking about some of the challenges that are coming up from our conversations with other states.
Thank you, Mireya. Okay, so after all of the work that Mireya and her team did to research Universal FAFSA, like she said, including surveying and talking to people, uAspire put together this list of recommendations for Universal FAFSA legislation. And I know you can all see them on your screen, but I want to talk a little bit about them and what exactly they mean and why we landed at these places. So the first suggestion is that the bill center FAFSA submission and not FAFSA completion. And while we acknowledge that it is ultimately FAFSA completion that we want, we understand that there are variables that are out of a student's control that might prevent them from actually being able to complete the FAFSA. So they might be able to submit it, but there might be a kickback that says, hey, we need X additional information. We would not want that to kind of either force a student to have to complete a waiver or for it to, God forbid, delay their commencement. So for that reason, we are suggesting that states, including this one, center FAFSA submission and not completion. District support is something that has proven critical. It's one thing that Mireya and her team have let me know in their conversations is that when there is support, the schools are better situated to support their students. And so that is something that is really, really critical. Provisions for funding alongside that support were also critical. I will mention that HB 1294 will meet this recommendation when there are funds allocated into the FAFSA Trust Fund, which is a part of this bill. But those provisions, like Mireya said, were very essential. So in states where it was modeled and successful, like Louisiana, they've done things like implement FAFSA workshops and just allowed schools to be somewhat innovative in thinking about ways to support students in FAFSA completion. And so we would like to also make that recommendation because that's where the greatest benefit has been seen, is where schools also have support. Increased funding should be made available to districts with lower completion rates. Again, this is also something that is covered within the bill, but for obvious reasons, I think it makes sense to prioritize districts in which students have less support with FAFSA completion and are just less likely to be enrolling in post-secondary education. Again, that language is embedded right into the bill. The state administrative agency should provide the waiver forms. The reason for that, again, is because the waiver forms that have come out in different states, some schools have been able to create their own, some districts have been able to create their own, and it has led to just mass confusion. So for that reason, we recommend that the state administrative agency provide one standard waiver and opt-out form that students and schools can use to opt out of the FAFSA requirement. I will also add that we have in this bill some pretty robust options for waiver and opt-out. We do acknowledge that not every student wants to go to college. Some students have other plans after school. But the point of this bill is to make sure that any student who is even remotely considering post-secondary education has access to the information about their aid eligibility. The waivers must not require students or families to disclose their citizenship status, and it's actually prohibited, in the language in this bill, because the purpose is not to have students or families kind of out themselves as undocumented. If that is the case, it is, again, to make sure that students who are wanting to pursue post-secondary education can do that, and families should be able to opt out or waive out in a safe fashion. Schools and districts need to report on numbers annually. That is the numbers of FAFSA completed, the numbers of waivers completed as well. And the reason for that is obviously so we can kind of monitor completion rates and see what districts might need additional support in completing the FAFSA. And then the last one I think is really, really important, and that is that there needs to be at least one academic year between the law passing and the effective date. And the reason uAspire is making that recommendation is because schools need time to prepare, especially if we're sending a mandate down the line and schools don't have the opportunity. It can lead to commotion, which is not the plan. So the FAFSA, if this bill were to pass, it would be in 2026 with the trust fund, the FAFSA fund, being established 1 year earlier. And the reason for that gap recommended here in Massachusetts is because on the federal side of things, the FAFSA simplification process is kind of underway, and the hope is that any kinks that may come of that process will be ironed out by that point. And also that the FAFSA is a much easier process for schools to be able to support students and families with at the opposite end of this. So this is kind of the reason why the effective date in Massachusetts is extended beyond a year. With that, I would like to transition the conversation slightly and pass the torch to the chairman of the Board of Higher Education, Chris Gabrielli, to talk to us a little bit about what this bill means potentially for the Commonwealth equity agenda. Mr. Chairman.
Femi, thank you for inviting me. I want to start just by really thanking you and Ed Trust and everyone involved in putting this together. Such an important topic, one that's been of great interest to me for a while. And in the presentations on the research in other states and the data and the specificity of the proposals, I really appreciate Representative Vargas leaving off with his description of his commitment to it. I mean, this is just an impressive effort to really understand and thoughtfully develop legislation. And uAspire, an organization I've been familiar with since its inception, is just a great example of a really outstanding contributor to our state, obviously in its direct actions and work with students, but also very much on this policy front. So thanks to all of you. I have one, those TV ads that have to have like disclosures. My disclosure is I am speaking primarily for myself. I am in my 9th year as chairman of the Board of Higher Ed. I think I'm the longest standing chair in the country. Pleased to be able to serve a second governor in this regard. But we do not have an official board policy on this, and I'm delighted to be here, but I don't want to say anything that I'm saying is the views officially voted upon or sanctioned by our board. What our board has super embraced is an equity agenda. And for several years now, we've been, I think, one of the only states in the country that has stood by the view that while total attainment of our population, the percentage of students who have grown-ups, who have adults, who have credentials that help them in post-secondary credentials that help them succeed in the workplace primarily, and in life, primarily college degrees, but also certificates and so on, that such attainment is an important goal, and Massachusetts leads the country in our attainment levels, that the inequitability of how attainment is distributed in our state is by far the more pressing agenda for us. And that does differentiate us from those states. Have we achieved everything we need to do to offset that? Obviously not, but we've made it our top goal. And in that regard, we spent a year, and uAspire and EdTrust and others on this call were very helpful along the way, and at our decision point in December, looking at our higher ed finance system. And I'm pleased to say that the governor's proposal for this coming year, including the use of the fair share money, is aligned with several other groups that, from outside and inside, aligned with, I believe, legislation called the Cherish Act that has been filed, aligned with a lot of thinking, and that puts the single highest premium on more financial aid for students. So it's great to have more financial aid. Governor's budget would put $120 million more, which, given that we have about $180 million, is a lot of money. But FAFSA is critical. It's the gatekeeper for this. And I always knew that, but I became particularly aware of it during the pandemic when we learned, we saw how precipitously the rates were falling. I helped try to get galvanized discussions amongst commissioners and others about what we could do to help offset that. And that's the time when I came to understand some other states were taking policy positions bolder than we have taken to date. So, but one of the reasons I want to emphasize the importance of FAFSA is Massachusetts, like many states, is increasingly tying adding state aid, and all of that is kind of last dollar in its thinking, and is only benefits students who filled out the FAFSA. So it's a lot more than just the very valuable federal aid that gets unlocked. I also really appreciate the point that was brought up. What really shifted my own personal view to being enthusiastic about this was that the Louisiana data wasn't just that students filled out more paperwork. God knows we all have a lot of paperwork in our life already, but that they went and matriculated at greater rates. So it wasn't just, empty compliance. It was going down a road to fulfill themselves. Last thing I want to say is what the details of the legislation are really matter. And I can see that Representative Vargas has really dug in, and so have all of you. I don't know what all the exact features should be, but this is the kind of discussion we should be having and then acting on in this state. And I really appreciate the legislature stepping up. It makes it a lot easier when the legislature says you must do something than when, optional decisions get made. So I really appreciate the attention of the legislature to that. I personally think we should take some form of action in this type of direction. If I had to vote on something today, I would personally vote for it, but I want to be clear, we haven't taken an official position. I think I said that at the beginning, but man, am I excited to be on a Zoom call with the level of energy and leadership around doing more and better in our state, and as soon as we can, to really unlock opportunity for far more. So thanks for inviting me and including me, and thanks for your leadership. In this case, I'm trying to catch up to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Before we move on, I would like to also note that we have a student here who would like to say a couple of words about what FAFSA completion and support with FAFSA completion would mean for first-generation students. So I want to pass the torch to Jenny from UMass Boston to say a couple of words. Jenny, the floor is yours.
Oh, hello, my name is Jenny. I am a current junior at UMass Boston. For FAFSA, I was very fortunate and lucky enough to go to a high school that really sat down with me and explained the whole FAFSA process. When I first started applying to college, I kid you not, loans was my biggest fear. I had no type of knowledge of any financial aid. And that was really my fear. That almost stopped me from going to college, but I had another advisor who sat me down and literally we completed the FAFSA together. And I believe without her help, I wouldn't be in my third year of college and getting this far. But I feel not even just in high school, but middle schoolers who are transitioning into high school, getting a little bit more knowledge about FAFSA, knowing what needs to be done for it to be completed. And even in high school, I know some high schoolers, they look forward, to getting with friends and getting the work done. But when it comes to their their third year of high school and like senior year finally hits, like you need X, Y, and Z documents just to complete the FAFSA. I did complete it. I did complete my FAFSA for this year, which was, I was lucky enough to receive help. Not many students receive help. And coming from me, I'm a low income student. My mom never went to college, so she had no idea what FAFSA is until like my advisor had to explain it. Oh, like FAFSA would give you some sort of financial aid. It was more like a leverage, and that was such a relief to me. And I feel like schools, well, high schools in general should like get together a little bit more and explain really like what FAFSA is to other students as well before they graduate.
Thank you, Jenny. Appreciate it. Thank you for joining us. On your screen, I also have a quote from another student at Simmons University who really, really wanted to be here today, but is in class at this time. So Mabel left us with this quote. She's very adamant that she almost did not land in college because she came upon her senior year and was not aware that financial aid was a thing. And because she is from a low income background, had pretty much written college off. So very late in the game, someone told her that there was federal funding available that she could apply for through the FAFSA, which immediately changed her mind. And again, now she is a successful student at Simmons. So we're happy to have this quote for her, and she's excited for this bill, and just really truly believe that students need to complete the FAFSA before high school so that they're aware of their aid eligibility before commencement rolls around. And I also want to just share one more quote from our partners at Journey into Education and Teaching. So our friends at JET work with adult college students, and in doing so have seen directly, the difficulties that students have in navigating the FAFSA. And they're also supportive of this legislation, really believing that universal FAFSA can help future generations kind of overcome those challenges that currently are experienced as challenges, when completing the FAFSA. So whether students choose to go to high school immediately after, or they take a break or go on some other path, this legislation would help them get baseline knowledge, at least, about what the FAFSA is and what the end result of completing the FAFSA will be, which is, again, making sure that you are aware of your aid eligibility. Before we get to the Q&A section, I would like to pass the mic to my colleague, Genesis Corella from the Education Trust, to say a few words, and then we'll happily take some questions if folks have questions about the bill or about universal FAFSA in general. Genesis?
Thank you, Femi, and good afternoon, state senators, representatives, state house staff, and partners. Thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon. Like Femi shared, my name is Genesis Corella, and I'm the Massachusetts Policy Associate for the Education Trust. At the Education Trust, we work to advance policies and practices that improve outcomes and opportunities in education from preschool through college for our most systemically underserved students. And before we begin the question and answer portion of today's briefing, I want to leave you with a few closing words. Today, we've heard about the correlation between FAFSA completion and college enrollment, and the data is really clear. Increased FAFSA completion rates lead to an increase in enrollment rates, which is what we need at a time when enrollment rates are at their lowest point in nearly 20 years. And furthermore, we want our students of color, students from low-income backgrounds, and first-generation students who are eligible for financial aid to really receive the necessary information and support so that they can access it. Too many Massachusetts students forego college and other opportunities that require FAFSA completion because they're unaware of their aid eligibility, like Femi and Rep. Vargas shared, leaving over $48 million in Pell dollars on the table. And we really need more students of color, students from low-income families, and first-generation students to enroll in college, especially at this time, not only to meet the goals outlined in the Commonwealth's equity agenda, but also because we know that students who are statistically the least likely to enroll in college are students who stand to gain the most from degree attainment. And so with that, we ask the dignitaries on this call to co-sponsor this bill to help ensure that Massachusetts students have access to information about financial aid. And in addition, we request that legislative representatives share these details from the briefings, from this briefing with your office, and ask partners to support this legislation. Just to share, attendees will receive follow-up materials following this briefing, including the slide deck that was shared with live links to data and sources, as well as uAspire's national briefing on Universal FAFSA. Thank you so much again for your time. And with that, I'll pass it over to Mireya for the Q&A portion of today's agenda.
Thank you, Genesis. So with that, we have a few minutes left and would happily take any questions. If folks would like to ask questions either of uAspire or of Representative Vargas's office, kind of about Universal FAFSA generally, or questions about this Massachusetts specific bill. Check. So far, I don't see any questions. Does anyone have any questions that we can answer? I'll give it a couple minutes and let people sit with it.
Representative Donahue,
Oh.
I see your hand raised.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. It was really interesting. I was just looking to see if there was any long-term information. I've been reading a lot about student debt and the issues where people say, we're told, don't worry about loans, you'll, get all the financial aid you want and you'll be able to pay them back. And just all of those issues. So I didn't know how much of that particular issue of the overwhelming college student debt so many people have has been looked at in this context.
I will say that the primary focus for this particular piece of legislation, which has been so nationally, has been primarily to get students from high school to that hump of getting them into college, with the consideration that we want them to complete the FAFSA because that is where they learn about Pell eligibility and where they also stand to learn about, like here in Massachusetts, where they can learn about like Mass grant eligibility and things like that. But as far as the implications for student debt, these policies are fairly new, and so it'll be interesting over time to see how they play out and if this leads to students taking on less debt. But because they've only come out in the last few years, the data that we kind of have access to is somewhat limited. Louisiana is the state with the most information that we've pulled the most from, but it will be, I think, interesting to learn about implications for that as these policies become enacted in more states.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Any other questions? Okay, well, if we do not have any questions, I am always a fan of giving people time back. But before I do that, I would like to share in the chat. I will drop my contact information. And if folks have questions that they would like answered but don't want to necessarily ask them on this call, I welcome communications from folks to learn more about this bill. So I'm going to put that in the chat now. Perfect. Thank you all. Well, I would like to again take a moment to extend thanks to Representative Vargas, to all of the state senators, representatives, and state house staff who made time to join us for this briefing this afternoon. Thank you to Chairman Gabrielli for taking a few minutes to talk about the implications for the equity agenda. Again, I'm happy to give folks a few minutes of time back, but welcome. Oh, wait, I see a hand, Mr. Chairman.
That was me waving.
Oh, okay. Perfect. All right. Sorry about that. Well, in that case, we can wrap up, and I welcome follow-up communications from you all, and thank you all for your time.
Thanks for your leadership.
Of course.
Really
Thank you
important
all.
moment.
Thank you, everyone.